Today we're going to talk about attitudes. And I think you saw Brother Dean has an attitude, and it's one that we don't really enjoy, do we? Attitude, the talk today is going to be on either you control them or they control you. The points that will be discussed today are going to be, what are attitudes? And we just saw one. How do we get our attitudes? Who tries to manipulate our attitudes? And there are biases that prevent critical thinking because of attitudes as well. Once you believe something, it is very difficult for you to turn the corner and decide, I guess I was wrong. So many times people will form an opinion or an attitude towards something, and they cannot change, basically. I mean, you've seen that in the weapons of mass destruction, for instance, in Iraq. There's still something like 35% of the people believe that there were still weapons of mass destruction there. And because once they get that locked in, you can even prove to them that there's no evidence. They still believe it. So, and I think that's the type of thing we're going to be discussing today. Bob Herzog is going to be our speaker. He was discovered on an op-ed a while back, and he seemed to make sense to us. And so we contacted him, and his op-ed, we have a copy of it out there on the counter, is why do people continue to believe lies? And I think it's very appropriate right now because look at all the lies that were being pronounced throughout the campaign, and people just ate it all up because that's what they wanted to believe. So it's something else. Bob is a traveler. He has trouble staying at one place very long. He was born in Pennsylvania. He didn't stay too long because he went to high school in Ohio. He was in the Air Force at various bases. He attended University of North Texas and received a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science. He attended Iowa U to get his PhD. Then he went to the University of Maine, then to the University of Indiana. He still teaches online at the University of Miami in Ohio. And he's now living here in Tucson, and we're fortunate enough to capture him long enough that he can come in and give us a talk today. He sounded like he knew what he was talking about when he was in that op-ed. So we invited him to come and give us a talk. Give it up for Bob Herzog.
Thank you, Jerry, for your introduction, and thank you all for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be among free thinkers and critical thinkers. And I think you'll agree with me that critical thinking is a commodity which is in very short supply in our nation today. I offer as evidence for that conclusion the 2016 presidential race. Critical thinking is not taught in our schools. It's unfortunate. I wish that it were. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my experience with learning critical thinking in public schools. I can remember my 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Callahan. She was a very nice lady, grandmotherly, kind most of the time. But she had a very unique way of keeping discipline in her class. When you broke one of her rules, you were called to the front of the room and then sent to the corner to sit in her trash can. It was very embarrassing. I can tell from personal experience. And she always taught us and emphasized through the whole school year that we should think for ourselves and to think critically. And she said over and over, never let anyone do your thinking for you. But whenever I thought for myself, I ended up in Mrs. Callahan's trash can. But I'm really not here to talk to you about the skills of critical thinking. I suspect most of you already know them. I want to talk to you a little bit about how the way our mind works, the process of thinking, interferes with critical thinking. And the real culprit in that is attitudes. And so the first slide here says, either you control your attitude or it controls you. And that's quite true. The problem with attitudes is, as I said, they interfere with our ability to think critically if we allow them to do so. And they do it in the background. They do it without our really being aware that they're doing that they're inhibiting our critical thinking ability. So first, let me just say a word or two about what is an attitude, because colloquially we use the term attitude in ways that a social psychologist would not use that term. To a social psychologist, an attitude has a factual element, or at least if someone asks us, why do you believe a certain way, or why do you have this particular opinion, you can cite some facts that support that opinion. And whether they're true facts or not is a question, but we have a factual element underlying our attitudes. There's an affective element, that's an emotional thing, how strongly we believe in that attitude. And the more strongly you believe in that attitude, the more it inhibits your ability to think critically. And there's a behavioral element, so that when you have an attitude, you usually behave in some way that demonstrates that attitude. You even just the fact of talking about it and trying to convince someone else of the rightness of your attitude is that behavioral element. There are a number of theories about how attitudes are formed, more than the three I've listed up here, but the three main overriding theories are the behavioral theory, B.F. Skinner and many of his colleagues came up with, and Daniel Katz functional theory, and cognitive dissonance theory. And I won't say much about the behavioral theory, because at least 60% of the behaviorists don't think we have attitudes. The functional theory, Daniel Katz functional theory, I want to say a couple words about it, because it's one of the main theories that demonstrates how attitudes and your holding of attitudes short-circuit your critical thinking. And then I want to spend some time talking about cognitive dissonance theory, which, at least in my opinion, is the most important theory of attitude formation and attitude maintenance that's ever been designed or discovered, I should say. And that's Leon Festinger's theory. So Katz said, Daniel Katz, social psychologist, said that we hold attitudes, or we form attitudes for because they serve four functions: either a knowledge function, an instrumental function, a value expressive function, or an ego defensive function. Let me just say a word or two about each of those. People, all of us, want to have predictability, clarity in our lives, and so we form attitudes that help us gain that clarity, that help us understand what's going on. So if you want to believe in an afterlife, then you'll have a positive attitude towards some religion. Stereotyping is an attitude based in the knowledge function, because if you can take someone or something and put it into a category whose prerequisites are already known, then you know how that thing or that person is going to behave. It gives you clarity. It helps us make sense of a complex world. But in the background, because we've categorized this thing or this person, we stopped thinking critically about it. And so knowledge function gives us knowledge, but it also inhibits critical thinking or accurate thinking. Katz's instrumental function, attitudes serve our needs. If you're a business person, you're likely to favor a political party that will lower business taxes. If you're a college student, you may favor the political party that will make it easier for you to repay your student loans. If you feel insecure, you're likely to favor the political party that offers you a strong law and order candidate. Or you're also likely to buy a home security system, advertisers know. So the instrumental function then also stops our critical thinking about whatever issue we're talking about. But it serves our needs and satisfies us in an instrumental way. Katz's value expressive function, we form attitudes to reinforce beliefs about ourselves, beliefs that we want others to know, the good things we see in ourselves. We form an attitude to express those, to demonstrate them. So if you see yourself as an enlightened conservative, you might have joined the anyone but Trump movement. If you see yourself as a liberal, you might have put a Bernie Sanders sign in your yard. If you see yourself as an evangelical Christian, you might have a honk if you love Jesus bumper sticker on your car. I guess there are not too many of those in the parking lot today. But the value expressive function helps us feel good about ourselves, but at the same time inhibits our ability to think critically about any of those things. We focus on the single thing that value expresses and fail to think of other things that might also be relevant. The ego defensive function, if the value expressive function expresses those things we see good about ourselves, the ego defensive function protects us from those things that we perceive as our weakness. So if people laughed at you when you went to gym class in high school, you probably form an attitude that's opposite of, that opposes high school athletics. If you feel inferior, if you have an inferior self-concept, then you may often form an attitude of superiority. Ego defensive function stops critical thinking on the spot. They defend us, ego defensive function defends us from the harsh realities of the real world at the expense of our being able to think critically about those things that we see are our weaknesses. So that's Daniel Katz's 4 functions of attitudes, and according to that theory, any attitude we hold serves at least one or perhaps more of those functions and inhibits our ability to think critically. Now, as I said, cognitive dissonance theory, in my opinion, and in an opinion of many other social psychologists as well, is probably the most important theory that helps us understand why we hold on to attitudes even when sometimes the basis for that attitude is shown to be false or in doubt. The theory is based on the idea that it's very difficult for us to hold two thoughts which are opposite of one another, two contradictory thoughts, or it's difficult for us to entertain the idea that we behave in a way different from the attitude of the belief that we have. We suffer what Leon Festinger called cognitive dissonance, and I'll tell you what that is in just a moment. Once we have an attitude, Festinger told us that we strive then to crush any thought that contradicts it, and you can see how that certainly inhibits critical thinking, because as soon as that thought appears, we want to somehow put it away in our minds now. We strive to rationalize any inconsistency in behavior and thought. Dissonance theory explains why we hold on to beliefs when there's strong evidence to show that that belief is faulty. Cognitive dissonance is a mental discomfort. It's a feeling in your mind that is uncomfortable and that you want to get rid of. And the way and one of the ways, not maybe the only way, but one of the ways that you get rid of it is by rationalizing the contradiction. The easiest example of that is smokers. We probably all know someone who smokes. And what is that smoker, if he's alive in this world today, knows that smoking is bad for your health, and indeed is killing you while you're enjoying the cigarette. So what does that person do? If he's an intelligent person, one thought would be, I'm a reasonably intelligent person. I don't do things that endanger my health. And the other thought is, I smoke. And those two diametrically opposed thoughts are very difficult for the person to rationalize. But they try. They say things like, I enjoy smoking, and I'd rather live a short, happy life than a long, unhappy one. Or, and you've probably heard that, and I have, or smoking kills my appetite, and so it's really healthy for me because I don't eat so much and I won't be overweight. Or the one that I've heard that, well, I knew a guy who smoked 3 packs a day, died at 96 of natural causes. And, you know, there might be 1 or 2 cases of that in the world, but everybody knows that smoking's killing you, and yet you find a way, if you're a smoker, to rationalize that. That's cognitive dissonance forcing you to do that. You can't hold those 2 thoughts together at the same time, Festinger realized. So we reduce dissonance by rationalizing. There are other ways of reducing dissonance, but that's the primary way. How did Festinger come up with this theory? Well, I want to tell you a story about that because it's a fascinating story. Leon Festinger was a social psychologist who taught at the University of Michigan, and in the area where he was teaching, it's not in the same town there, but in the nearby area, he and some of his colleagues discovered a Doomsday Cult that had predicted the end of the world. And Professor Festinger and his colleagues wanted to see what would happen when the end of the world didn't happen, or they wanted to be there when it did happen. So they went down to study it. They joined the group and studied it. Now, these guys had been doing this for a couple of years, and they predicted that, oh, by the way, the pictures here are not the real pictures. I just got these from the internet. This happened in 1954, and I don't think there are any real pictures of it. But in any event, they'd been preparing, this cult had been preparing for this thing for years. They'd known about it, and the time was upon them now. In the past, they had avoided the limelight. They didn't advertise. They didn't write letters to the editor. They didn't try to convert people to their point of view. They just went about their business in a quiet way, getting ready for the end of the world. In Festinger's book, which is called When Prophecy Fails, he gave the name of the leader of the group as Mrs. Keach. That wasn't her real name, but that's the name he used. She receives messages from the planet Clarion. She receives them. Nobody knows where Clarion is, by the way, but she receives these messages by what she called automatic writing. And they just appeared to her like, you know, the writing on the wall just kind of appeared to her. And those were the messages from the Clarions. And according to Mrs. Keach, the Clarions will destroy the Earth on December 21st, 1954. But, according to her, all is not lost. The Clarions have sent a spaceship to remove the cult members from the Earth before the cataclysm because of their faith and because of their hard work, which very few people on Earth knew about, but they were doing it. And so on December 20th, this is the night before, now the Earth is supposed to be destroyed, they are gathered outside the home in Mrs. Keach's backyard, waiting to be picked up by the spaceship or beamed up or whatever was going to happen. And they had taken all the metal out of their, off their clothes, cut off the zippers. Anything that had metal on had to be done away with. They were standing there in the cold, December 20th in Michigan. Now it's not warm, prepared to be taken into space. They've gone through a great deal of effort and difficulty, and this is an important aspect of it, because the more difficulty you go to hold your attitude, the stronger the dissonance will be. So, you know, people have laughed at them who knew about what they were doing. They've left their jobs. They left their colleges. They left their homes. They left their family in some cases in order to be prepared for the destruction of the Earth and to be hauled up into space and to go off to the planet Clarion. No spaceship. Midnight comes, no spaceship. Members standing in stunned silence. Now it's the 21st. The Earth is about to be blown to dust. And Mrs. Keach is in tears. What can they do? They stand there for 4 hours. And then 1 hour later, so they've been there 5 hours in this freezing cold. And Mrs. Keach receives a message from the Clarions. The destruction has been called off. They've saved the world because of the light that they spread, because of their hard work and their faith. The God of the earth, as they called it, has decided to call off, to cancel the destruction. And this is not just something that, well, it is kind of something they made up, but they believed it. This is a powerful belief now that they have. It's a way of, you might think, well, you know, they say, what a dummy I was, you know, and I believed all this stuff and nothing happened. But they didn't do that. They found a way to maintain that belief. And Festinger says that's because of the cognitive dissonance, that mental pressure to keep some sort of consistency in their views and their behavior. So they've saved the world. Now, Festinger predicted it. This is what he predicted would happen, that the drive to maintain consistency, cognitive dissonance, would cause them to hang on to that belief in some way. Now we may be kind of familiar with that sort of thing today, but in 1954, this was quite a unique idea, and changed the way social psychologists looked at attitudes. The people now reversed their quiet approach. Now they were out in the community trying to persuade people that their point of view was right and that they had saved the world, and draw people into their group. And They wrote letters to the editor. They tried to get interviewed on local radio programs. And as far as I know, for years and years after that, they still maintained their belief and kept their group together, celebrating the time when they saved the earth. Now, a similar situation occurred 2,000 years ago. The disciples of an itinerant apocalyptic preacher gave up everything. They left their homes. They left their families. Some of them were fishermen. They put away their nets and followed this itinerant preacher around the desert of Galilee. And after some period of time, and they thought, and I'm quoting here Professor Bart D. Ehrman from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, that most religious scholars today realize that Jesus never thought he was God, and that most of his disciples didn't. They thought of him as setting up a worldly kingdom of some sort in which they would be the leaders of that community, of that kingdom. And so all of a sudden now, this great plan is crushed. Jesus is taken prisoner, tried by the Romans, found guilty of treason against the Roman Empire, and executed for that purpose, for that reason. And like Mrs. Keach's followers, they're there in stunned silence. What can they do? How can they understand this? Did they knock themselves in the head and say, wow, what a dummy I was? And go back to get out their fishing nets and go back to catching fish? They didn't. Instead, they believed that, wait a minute, this was God's plan all along. And Jesus really was God's son, and he was sent here to save the world. And now we have to continue that work to save the world. And these guys were a great deal more successful than Mrs. Keach's followers in bringing about their point of view. That point of view eventually took over the Roman Empire, and then eventually the whole Western civilization. And what a different world we have today than we would have if that group of people had just said, well, that was a bad idea, and gone back to fishing. But cognitive dissonance, working in the background in ways that they never realized, pushed them to hang on to that belief, and to in fact change the world we live in right now. So why is cognitive dissonance important? You and I are seldom faced with those kind of dramatic events, but cognitive dissonance in your mind, working in the background, influences practically every kind of attitude and belief that you have. And every value judgment that you make is influenced by cognitive dissonance. And to improve your critical thinking, you need to become aware of the impact that cognitive dissonance has on you. Because the more aware you are of it, the less impact it has on your thinking. The more I know that cognitive dissonance is pushing me away from critical thinking, the more easier it is for me to actually think critically, to put that aside. That's the main message that I want to get over to you today. Now, I'd like to just spend a last couple of minutes talking about a couple of other cognitive biases that influence our thinking. They're called a heuristic. Sometimes they use the term heuristic. Rule of thumb, measure twice, cut once is a heuristic. It's a pretty good one most of the time, but But you can see that that heuristic just cuts out critical thinking. I don't have to think too much about it. I know exactly what to do. It helps us sort out complex ideas and, as I say, short circuits critical thinking. The confirmation bias is one of the most important and one of the most common ones that we have. I can illustrate that with the toilet seat case. Imagine a couple, a man and woman, living together in an apartment, and she says to him, "Why do you never put the toilet seat down after you use the bathroom?" And he says to her, "I hate to inform you, honey, but I always put the toilet seat down after I use the bathroom." Now, they both have the same data set. They make the same observations. Well, how do they come to two totally opposite, diametrically opposed conclusions? Well, confirmation bias is the answer. When he uses the bathroom and he puts the toilet seat down, it registers. He's actually made a physical move. And when he forgets to put the toilet seat down, by definition, he doesn't know he didn't do it. And so, to him, he always puts the toilet seat down. When she comes to the bathroom and the toilet seat is up, she has to reach up and put it down. That registers in her mind. That confirms what she's been thinking all along. And when, of course, the toilet seat is down, everything's normal. It doesn't make a register. So that's confirmation bias. And it happens in a lot of different ways. Perhaps you remember the political debates of the last election campaign. And the people who watched the debate, those who supported Trump, noticed all the good points he made, and they thought he won. And the people who supported Clinton noticed all the good points she made, and they thought she won. Political candidates themselves are often, very often, subject to confirmation bias. They go out every day to a political campaign where everybody's cheering and yay and hollering and doing all, screaming and hollering how good they are. And most political campaigns, at least the sophisticated ones, have statisticians and pollsters who understand confirmation bias. They tell the candidate that be careful of that, but the candidate just sees these people cheering and they fall victim to that confirmation bias. Any superstition works, is supported by confirmation bias. I can remember my wife Bonnie, public school teacher, coming home from work sometimes and saying, "Boy, oh boy, the kids were crazy today. There must have been a full moon." Now it's very seldom that we went out actually to see if there was a full moon, but if we had done so and there was a full moon there, I'm sure Bonnie would have said, "See, I told you so. I knew it." And if there wasn't a full moon, we probably would have just shrugged and gone back. Confirmation bias leads us to support those things. If you believe that black cats bring you bad luck, then you see a black cat and you have bad luck, it registers. You see a black cat and you don't have bad luck, it just goes on. So confirmation bias happens over and over in so many different ways. And what it does is inhibit our critical thinking because we don't examine the entire data set. We just examine those, we sort of cherry pick the data, if you can call it that way. Another heuristic I'd like to mention to you quickly is the anchoring. Advertisers know about anchoring. You focus on certain aspects of a product, or sometimes a political candidate as well. In automobile advertising, we may focus on horsepower, or gas mileage, or luxury, just one aspect of a particular product, and that shuts out our thinking about other things like reliability or anything else about the product, or warranty, or what have you. In politics, we focus on a single aspect of a candidate very often. And we may anchor on that aspect, say the candidate's tax policy or the candidate's policy on homeland security or immigration, and shut out all the other things such as truthfulness, a minor aspect, or the ability to actually bring about those things that are being promised. We rationalize those other aspects of the candidate. So all of these things, these heuristics, are related in a way to cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is pushing us towards seeing the things that that our attitude or our mental belief wants us to see. And once again, I want to emphasize that we're not lost here. If we want to be critical thinkers, then your task is to recognize that your mind, the way your mind works, the process of thinking, is interfering with your ability to think in a critical and objective way. And once you realize that, you can take a step towards becoming a more effective critical thinker. So we can engage in meta thinking about our thinking, and I encourage us all to do that. Sometimes it's hard because we suffer sometimes mental anguish in doing so. We can think past our tendency to categorize things. We can we can think about how the way we think short circuits our critical thinking, and we can put a stop to it. We can challenge our own thoughts. That's a difficult thing to do. We can develop an attitude towards critical thinking and make that attitude stick, and make that to be your primary attitude, that you're going to think critically about anything. So last thing I'd like to say to you is something about what an attitude toward critical thinking involves. First, if you're going to be a critical thinker, you have to be curious. You have to want to know things, even if they're not important. You just have to, people who are curious are critical thinkers. They like to know stuff, even as Bonnie sometimes said, a lot of useless data that's stuck in our minds, but that's a good thing. We know things, and we like, and we are satisfied to find out these things. You have to be open-minded, and being open-minded means you're willing to entertain thoughts that contradict the thoughts that you have, and that's hard. That's where cognitive dissonance comes in. You have to be skeptical about everything, and being skeptical doesn't necessarily mean you reject everything out of hand. You simply say, if you don't know, that I don't know this. I don't have an opinion on this yet, and I won't have an opinion on it until I learn more about it. And you have to be humble. Being humble means that you have to be willing to say, "Ooh, that was a dumb idea I had one time, and now I have a different one." To err, my friends, is human. To admit to error when you're wrong is wisdom. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. We'll now take some questions for the speaker. Where were you before the election? That's what we needed. That's what I want to know. So if you'll come up here, it would be the best way to handle this, because otherwise we can't miss a mic around. So.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. most of what you're talking about applies to the individual. I'd like to hear from you what you think about extrapolating this to a groupthink situation. It appears to me in this last year, so many lies have been told, and people use confirmation bias to hold on to them. And now you have a whole group of people that buy into that, which then reinforces the individuals and makes it harder and harder to actually perform critical thinking because of the group think that's now evolved.
Groupthink is a phenomenon that social psychologists have studied, and it is the process of inhibiting critical thinking because all the members around us agree with something. There's been a lot of research on groupthink that says basically that once you recognize that everybody around you has a certain point of view, you find it very difficult to express your point of view. I could talk for a whole semester about some of the research on groupthink, because it's a very common thing that group communication researchers have looked into. But yeah, to answer your question, yes, groupthink plays an important part in the way in which the process of electing people takes place. They gather people, and once those people, and this is true of any opinion, once you form an opinion in a group and you're associated with a lot of members who agree with that, even those of you who are the atheist persuasion get together as atheists and talk about your point of view, it becomes difficult for someone to raise an opposing opinion. Religious groups, political groups, that's true. Groupthink is a major phenomenon that influences the way in which we behave and so forth. So,
how would you counteract that?
That's a very good point. The way you counteract it, if you're a group leader, for example, you have to encourage people to express opinions. A lot of times in a group, someone ventures to express an opposite opinion, and members of the group say, no, we don't want to hear that. As a group leader, you have to, and even as a group member, you have to say, wait a minute, we want to hear this. And then you discuss it. You allow people to come in. But that doesn't happen. I was a chairman of the Democratic Party when I taught at the University of Maine a long time ago, in the Aroostook County Democratic Party. And you'd find when you get in there, if someone wanted to express a point of view that maybe the Democratic Party wasn't quite right on this, people just sort of shouted them down. They didn't want to hear it. And so that's why we get ingrown. The only way to counter it is for people to be willing to entertain ideas that are different and to talk about them. You don't have to accept them, but you at least have to hear the people out. Yes, sir.
Many times in my life, I've come across people who I would call them being hypocritical, and that kind of reminds me of what we're talking about. And I thought about it, and I'm saying, and the person really wants to be comfortable. And I realize when I think about it that we all want, in our lives, we seek to be happy, to be comfortable. So, in other words, it's anti-intuitive to do critical thinking when it's more comfortable. And I'm just wondering if you could address that.
Well, I agree with you. That's one of the main points I hope to make today, that doing critical thinking is uncomfortable. It raises dissonance in your mind. This thing that Festinger called cognitive dissonance, you just have to think of it, in order to understand it, you just got to think of your own experience with a dissonant points of view to get a feeling. But that person who you think is being hypocritical may indeed not be being hypocritical. They may be just trying to be, as you say, comfortable.
But is it realistic to think that we're going to be able to change that if
Yes,
it's in
it
our
is.
DNA?
Well, I don't know that you can change it in somebody else. You can change it in yourself. You know, I can't change your way of do that, but I can change my own way of thinking.
Hi. How do you, and it's a long, probably another whole lecture, but how do you account for like emotions like, you know, anger and fear and all those other things in this? Because that's not rational and you can't really control that as easily.
Well, sometimes one of the ways that we dissipate the dissonance is to be angry at the other person. And I'll tell you what I think, by God, or sometimes to put the other person down. That's another way of, well, that's the most ridiculous point of view I've ever heard. You know, when you disagree with me, or anyone who believes that has got to be some kind of dummy. You know, that sort of thing is what we do to dissipate the dissonance. And the important thing is you really can't do something about someone else's thinking.
What about even yourself? I mean, like if you realize in yourself, like, well, I know I should be doing this, but I'm not. I'm really mad at myself. Then you have to go into other kinds of like rational motive therapy or something.
You know, the only thing you can say to you is who's in charge here? Is your mind in charge, or are you in charge of your mind? And no, that's important because you can let your emotions carry you to places where you don't want to go. And so the thing that you have to do is take charge of the way your thinking's going on. It's not easy.
I would like to ask your thoughts on a subject, what I consider to be a textbook example of uncritically held attitude. And I would like to hear your thoughts on both sides, because there are attitudes on both sides of most major issues. And this example that I have in mind is the events of 9/11 and how attitudes formed on both sides, if you will, if you understand my meaning there, in terms of what actually happened or what might have happened. So I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on those, the attitudes surrounding that specific event.
Are you talking about attitudes toward Muslims?
No, towards the events.
Towards the event.
What happened. People have differing opinions, if you will, or attitudes regarding what happened.
Oh.
I think he was indicating the theory that the administration staged it.
Well, the only thing we can do, you know, is to really look at it in a critical thinking way. I don't think there's any sort of evidence that would suggest that the administration, the Bush administration knew that there was some sort of attack about to happen, or that they would have allowed it if they did. That just seems to me, on the face of it, fairly incorrect. But if you're a critical thinker, you have to be open to explore that and to look for the evidence. That's all I can say about that. That a critical thinker might say, well, I want to see some evidence. I just don't want to see your point of view. But what is it that you base that on, and how realistic is that? You're welcome.
This is a question about the kind of a subset of this phenomenon of fake news that I would like you to comment on in general, but on the role, also specifically on the role of social media nowadays that didn't, exist until a few years ago. Brief example on Facebook. In the spirit of curiosity and open-mindedness, I've been on some of these conspiracy theory groups, which is really an exercise in frustration because you get some of these groups that are anti-Semitic and flat earthers, and even though they may have some reasonable attitudes on other mainstream issues like the Standing Rock, disputes,
Yeah.
but they have this, they conceptually kind of weave that into their own conspiratorial-minded worldview. So some of it is reasonable and some of it is just out there, and yet they, I guess, somehow through this cognitive dissonance process, they integrate it, but social media seems to feed and make it easier for people to engage in this kind of groupthink and.
Yeah. Sure. First, fake news is a whole different phenomenon that we're facing now that we really didn't. There's always been disinformation. That's part of the techniques of propaganda, to put out things that as news. Government agencies all around the world, not only ours, would try to get journalists to write stories about something that they knew wasn't true. It's an intellectual dishonesty to try to persuade people to buy into an idea that I know. An idea that I know that is untrue because I think you'll believe it. So that's sort of what fake news is. But the phenomenon of Facebook and people grabbing onto those somewhat, strange and conspiratorial ideas for which there's very little evidence is something that we are faced with now that a few years ago we wouldn't have even thought of. And that's part of, again, of what I was talking about. There's a part of me that looks at somebody who says something that sort of agrees with what I'm saying, and I want to say, hey, right on, yeah, you got it. What?
Just click like.
Just click like, yeah, and all you have to do, yeah, that's a good point. You just click a like, or you what do they call it on Facebook? You carry it on, share it with somebody. I don't do much on Facebook, but yeah, but the point is that if you have an idea and you're suffering some dissonance because the idea seems a little bit strange and other people aren't accepting it, when somebody else says something that is even close to your idea, you grab onto that because that helps dissipate the dissonance that you're feeling. And so the only way we can deal with that is in our own mind. One of the things that I encourage people to do is to be intellectually honest. Don't support arguments that you know are faulty just because out on the fringe somewhere they're sort of agreeing with some of the points you have. In other words, if you make an argument to someone else, you really need, if you're intellectually honest, you need to believe that argument yourself. And yes.
So we become intelligent, we think, we question what we say and believe, and we do the research and the data. But the problem is, what we really have, the numbers that scare me are over 80% of the evangelicals voted for the pussy grabber. 76% of Republicans did.
Yeah.
And so we're sitting here with our facts and we were through the election, and facts did not matter. And yet I don't think you can fight them the way they fought, or we're as bad as they are. If we spew the lies and we say the hate and we call them stupid and we do whatever it is, we become just like them. We aren't any better.
That's so true.
So, I mean, I feel like we are now at the point of being the only sane person in an insane asylum. And how do you get them to start questioning, thinking, not just, I really am now, and I never in my life have been in a spot where I really think there's an evil them. There's us and there's them.
Well, I don't know. I felt the same way.
How do we teach? How do we get them just to say,
well,
okay,
one of the things we
think.
one of the things we need to do, I think, is teach critical thinking in our public schools in ways much better than we do. Now, I know you and I can't do much about that, except to hope that saner minds take hold at some point. But when I listened to your question, I was thinking how I felt as Bonnie and I sat in front of our TV on election night and saw Trump winning. And when I had said to myself, there's no chance that this will happen, and really believed it. And then he won, and I wondered how people could actually come to the conclusion to vote for Trump. I said to my friends more times than I can tell you, well, he may be popular now, but when people get into the voting booth, they're going to think Trump, president, and go some other place.
And those that voted for him, but no, he wasn't, that he won't do anything he said, say the reason they felt comfortable doing it was because they thought the infrastructure was there to brace him, to balance him out. But we have a complete Republican Congress too, and a good portion of the, governorships. So I don't know the infrastructure's there to, hedge their bet.
Well, the only thing I've been able to say a little bit about that is that democracy's messy. It is, and we just have to, I think, do the best we can. You can't change other people's thinking. You can only change your own.
What do you think about intuition? Do you think it's often misunderstood? Intuition is often considered infallible because it's innate knowledge, but isn't it really a brain function that just tries to answer a question, and sometimes it's so compelling that you just have to believe it?
Well, I guess you have to follow your intuition sometimes. I think there's not much scientific evidence in support of intuition being right over real critical thinking, but certainly some people have a handle on what's going on better than others. And I think, unfortunately, Donald Trump had the handle on what was going on in the country a lot better than did the Democrats this time. And so maybe that's a support of intuition, but certainly I can't think of much evidence to support that intuition is better than actual critical thinking.
Well, I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I think people are so overwhelmingly convinced because it's my intuition.
Yeah. Well, sometimes, and I'll just offer this. Sometimes what we think of as intuition is really just our emotions. This is what I want to do.
First of all, I want to thank you for a very, very wonderful presentation here. I think that it's...
Thank you.
You see, they all agree with me. It's a rare occasion that everybody agrees with me, but I like it, and I'm sure that you like it. I think that what you brought up, the subject that you dealt with, which is scratching it on the top, as you know probably, and you would agree with me, I'm sure, is the fundamental thing of how we think, how we form our opinion. To answer this lady who asked how you convince people, how you reach them, you take them, you kidnap them when they are babies. This is what you do, and you get your crowd. And this is all the churchgoers are. They don't take them when, I mean, with a few exceptions, when they are 27 years old. They take them when they're born. And they're now celebrating Christmas, right? What's about Christmas? Oh, there was a magic when they were children. So they grow up, they don't believe in any of this. But the subject, the magic that they grew up with is still with them. And they carry it on, and it goes to politics, etc., and it affects everything in their lives later on. And brainwash, or the way, I call it brainwash because it's the final, but the upbringing, what we do with, that we form in young age, what we do to children, is what happens later. And we eat the fruit of it. Thank you.
No, I don't have a specific technique. I just make it a point to be those things I mentioned at the end, to be curious. I'm a very curious person. I love to know things, even if I don't have any real reason to know them at a particular point. I'm always willing to entertain ideas that contradict mine, but I hold people who present those ideas to some level of evidence, and I will say to them, why do you believe this? I make it a point that if I present an opinion to another person, that opinion is subject to challenge. I have to respect that person's challenge. And the same thing for other people. If you present an opinion to me, it's subject to a challenge. You have to be willing to hear my other opinion, and we can then talk about and come to a better conclusion. The best technique I can tell you is just to try to form an attitude, as I said at the end of my talk here, to form an attitude towards critical thinking, that you support and respect critical thinking. Somebody back there has it.
Just to turn around on yourself, you said you encourage people to be skeptical as well as humble and curious. The question is then, I guess it's okay to be skeptical about skepticism.
Yes, it is, I guess. I guess that would be a perfect thing to do. Yes, sir.
You just started to talk about Islam. The phenomenon of Islamophobia and bigotry in general, it seems like, if we want to even be self-critical to some extent, atheist writers like Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens and Bill Maher, while there are, of course, legitimate criticisms of Islam and, any and all religion, it seems like sometimes they venture into that realm of the fallacy of overgeneralization plus animus towards the other, the Islamic world, to the extent that Sam Harris, if I remember correctly, has advocated, has justified, racial or religious profiling of Muslims who enter the U.S. So these types of overgeneralized thinking have consequences for public policy. I mean, and to the other, sometimes liberals may also deny that ISIS and these people are, they're not real Islamic, people to the extent that they are, they couldn't be real Muslims even though they are expressing a religious motivation. So there may be some denial on the other side too. Where do you find the middle?
Well, I'm not quite sure I followed your question, but the middle ground is what we have to do is to be open to the other person's point of view and then require that person provide some evidence, some real objective evidence and argument that supports a point of view. And the middle ground to me is to be respectful of everybody's opinions. And even though I'm an atheist, I am respectful of everyone's religion. I don't put down religion, but I would certainly, if someone wanted to debate me about it, most people don't, but I would enjoy the debate, and I would require them to present the same kind of evidence that I would present.
Well, how respectful do you have to be of all right opinions?
Well, you're respectful, but you're also allowed to challenge. If a person presents a point of view which doesn't hold up with evidence or in argument, you can criticize the argument or the evidence. That's the kind of respect I would give the person. That if you present the opinion, I may well challenge it. You have to respect my challenge.
Have you ever changed anybody's mind, someone who has a different opinion about religion or politics?
No, I've never changed.
By laughing at them?
No, you don't by laughing at them. In fact, you never change another person's mind. You can present something to them and they change their own minds. We don't change people's minds. Right. Right.
I was curious if you could give us some advice on how to temper our emotions when dealing with critical thinking, because you can obviously see a lot of emotion-based.
Yes, we do.
And I would like some advice on that.
The only thing I can say to you can't, is to ask you who's in charge here. Are your emotions in charge of you? Are you in charge of them? There's there's an interesting thing in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where Alice says, how can you make any word be what you say it is? And I think it's the owl or somebody says, it's a question of who's in charge. Is your language in charge of you, or are you in charge of the language? And the same thing is true for your emotions. Are your emotions controlling you? If you do, then what you need to do is take charge of yourself, your emotions. You're in control of your emotions. When two people get into an argument, a man and a woman get into an argument, and maybe he goes out and slams the door, and then he realizes he shouldn't have slammed the door and says, see what you made me do? You know what I mean? Who's in charge here? And that's the advice I give you. If you have emotions, you're in charge. And you need to take charge of that.
I want to come to a little bit of defense of my friend Sam Harris and the other of the four horsemen. He has readily admitted that he no longer rides the hobby horse of mistaking humor and sarcasm. He has done some of that in his book End of Faith, where he talked about, you know, the Catholics and their crackers for host and their favorite wine for the blood of Christ. But he no longer does that. And a perfect example of how we can disagree or discuss issues is a little book that he has where he interviewed, or they just had a discussion with each other, a former jihadist who is now trying worldwide to bring about some sort of enlightenment in the Muslim community. And it's a wonderful little book where are you familiar with it? Have you read that?
No, I know Sam Harris, but I haven't seen that book.
I was going to ask if you had, and if you had, you agree that this is a way to discuss, because they just put everything out there and walk away friends.
I hope so, because you can't control someone else's belief. People have a right to their beliefs, even if they're wrong, and so you have to respect their having their belief.
I was under the impression that intuition and some emotionality does come from the mind. It's past experiences. It just doesn't pop up, you know. When you say emotion, there's a difference between intuition and the mind, because much of your intuition does come from past thinking.
Okay.
Yeah. I expect you to, I want you to argue with me or present your case.
All right.
Wants to know if you agree with that.
Yes, I do agree.
Okay, well, I think that's enough for now. And Bob, thank you very much again for wonderful.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay.